Morning, everyone who's joining. Morning. There's some housekeeping on the slide. A welcome to you all. A note that this webinar is going to be recorded, but also that your video and your audio is disabled today. There's a Q&A box, so please do make use of that. Your name may be in the Q&A, so just make sure that if you don't want your name in there, that you submit anonymously, and we'll get started. Just some key points from us. So the webinar will last about an hour. Please do submit your questions in the Q&A. You'll have the chance to upvote those questions for the ones that you really want to see answered, so please do make use of that. If you require closed captioning, please click on the CC box in your Zoom menu bar, so make sure that you're using that if you need to. Great. Okay, so I think we're going to get started. So yeah, a huge thank you for joining us and a big welcome to this session on social and behavioural science in government. This session is going to feature me. I'm Dr. Kitty Saunders. I'm a Senior Policy Fellow at BR UK UCL, who are kindly hosting this webinar, and I'm seconded to the Government Office for Science. And I'll be leading this session alongside Dr. Carrie Heitmeyer, who's the Head of Social Science at the Government Office for Science. So yeah, we're just really grateful to have you all here. In terms of the session itself, this is just a brief overview. So we're going to go through what is GoScience, what is the role of social and behavioural sciences in GoScience, what are the routes for academic engagement with government, what are areas of research interest or ARIs and how can they be of use to behavioural and social scientists, and then some reflections from me on my secondment into government, followed by a Q&A. So I hope you're all looking forward to it, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Carrie.
Thanks very much, Kitty, and great to be here to talk a little bit about the work that I do and also within sort of government more generally. So I will start off with an overview of Government Office for Science, which is where Kitty and I are both based. Next slide. So Government Office for Science has been around for about 60 years. The first government chief scientific advisor was appointed 60 years ago. And since then, we've had 13 different government chief scientific advisors. Professor Dame Angela McLean is the current chief scientific advisor, and broadly her role is to act as an intermediary between the scientific research community and policymakers. We sit within the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, also known as DSIT, but we are independent. So we are sort of within the department for sort of broader administrative purposes, but we don't report to a minister. We report to Angela. So that's one of the differences between ourselves and DSIT. Next slide, please. In terms of the work that we do, so we sort of provide advice, evidence, and insight to government, and through sort of particular mechanisms. So you'll probably be familiar with the SAGE, or the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, and then also another sort of one of the main mechanisms is the CST, so that's the Council for Science and Technology, which reports directly to the Prime Minister. And in addition to that, we also have networks, tools, and resources. So for example, Futures Toolkit, which focuses on sort of enabling policymakers to use the futures methods to better be able to sort of think through sort of what might be sort of futures options and scenarios for policymaking. We also have the broader Chief Scientific Advisor Network. So that is a network of CSAs across different departments. So in addition to Angela, most departments will have their own CSA, and as part of that, we have a broader CSA network that would then sort of coordinate that science delivery and science advice for governments. Next slide, please. So yes, so just to give a bit of an overview in terms of the way that GoScience is organized, I mentioned the SAGE, so we do quite a lot of work both in terms of resilience and emergency preparedness and the science to inform preparedness, and working closely with Cabinet Office and the COBRA unit. As well as national security. We also have another team that's devoted specifically to technology and science insights that look specifically at emerging technologies and how we can better understand the UK's role in the global, sort of wider global landscape, but also thinking through how we can sort of understand different metrics and indicators to enable policymakers to understand that the sort of emerging tech landscape. Foresight, rapid projects, another area where we bring together groups of academics and experts quickly to respond to emerging policy questions. And then more broadly, we have international engagement, academic expertise, and the government science and engineering profession, which is a profession that is interdisciplinary science and brings together across government practitioners across government. Next slide, please. Moving on to the role of social and behavioural science in the UK government. Next slide, please. So just to give you a bit of an overview, there is representation of social and behavioral science, I think, in pretty much every single department. Quite a lot, the more sort of formal institutional mechanism is the government social research profession, which has representation again in all departments and agencies. But there's also, in addition to that, behavioral science teams, social science teams that work alongside the government social research in working with policy teams as well as other analysts in government to make sure that those considerations around behavior, society, community are fed into policy making and the wider policy process. In addition to that, there are sort of broader informal networks. So there's a long-standing behavioral science and insights network that has been operating for several years and meets on a quarterly basis, well, on every sort of 2 months or so, to talk through sort of emerging evidence, feature new research that teams as well as independent academics have done, which is of interest, and then sort of think through capability building. The Whitehall Anthropology Network is also another similar example of that. And then in addition, there's embedded academics, policy fellows, for example, such as Kitty, who join government on a temporary basis to usually working with a particular policy team to bring in their deep expertise in terms of and sort of understanding of the broader evidence base for different areas. Next slide, please. Within Government Office for Science or GoScience, so the social science team is a relatively new innovation. GoScience is traditionally a STEM, primarily focused on STEM, but I think in particular with the COVID response and the sort of critical role that social and behavioral science played in sort of feeding into the COVID response, there was a clear sort of recognition that we didn't want to lose the momentum of having that that sort of access to social and behavioral science within government, but equally the importance within GoScience. So for example, when we're looking at a host of different areas which are sort of part of the GoScience remit, such as emergencies, emerging technology, net zero, there's a clear understanding and recognition that we can't just focus on the STEM side, that it's absolutely critical that alongside STEM expertise, you have that broader interdisciplinary offer. So bring in that social science to sort of work together through, again, sort of interdisciplinary approaches. Next slide, please. And so to give you a bit of an overview of what we do, so we started in about 2022, and the team has been slowly growing. We work primarily on emergencies because that's sort of the legacy that we grew out of, and so we've now I'll speak briefly soon in terms of the work that we do around social and behavioral science for emergencies. But we work very, very closely with around academic engagement. So how do we make sure that we can work with funders, with research organizations, with research institutes to be able to identify who the leading experts are around different areas across sort of different policy areas and bring in that expertise when there is a clear need and sort of act as a liaison between both departments, but also Go Science and the Chief Scientific Advisor Network to connect up the deep expertise outside of government with those needs within government. We do evidence reviews. We have other sort of capability building mechanisms, such as a sort of ongoing science and society webinars, and have had a number of leading speakers, both from social and behavioral science, but also journalists such as Angela Saini or Michael Marmot recently, who are speaking about issues where there's a clear societal and behavioral dimension. Next slide, please. And again, just to sort of talk through ways that social science scientists work with government. Again, I mentioned policy fellowships, and there's a number of different schemes that are sort of increasingly offering policy fellowships where academics or researchers can be embedded within policy teams. So there's ESRC, British Academy also has the policy fellowship program. And I mean, it's one of those things that the more you sort of start talking to people, you realize how many different opportunities there are in this space. We also work on programs and networks. So UPenn is an obvious one. Also research institutes or centers that are working at that interface between policy and research is another area that we're a sort of group of organizations where we work closer. There's always, in addition to that, there's always sort of one-off opportunities as well. I mean, obviously, civil service jobs is always will have opportunities to join government on a sort of more permanent basis, but there's also short-term contracts and secondments, et cetera. And then finally, we work very closely with investments such as the Behavioural Research UK, and then other similar investments, for example, Access on Environmental Science, and more recently the NABS Plus, which focuses on national security and defense. Next slide, please. So just to give you, we thought it would be useful to talk through a sort of case study to give you a bit more of an understanding or sort of example about a specific area that we do, that we work in within Go Science. So this is the Social and Behavioral Science for Emergency group was set up in 2022. And this was part, again, sort of following the COVID legacy, and was as a direct result of then Chief Scientific Advisor Patrick Vallance and National Statistician Ian Diamond both agreeing that there was a need to set up a more formal structure to be able to essentially both mobilize social and behavioral science research within government, but also externally in the event of a crisis. So, for example, when something happens, how do we make sure that we are bringing together the right people with expertise, both within government, but also accessing those people, those deep experts in academia or the wider research community. And also then, but also sort of, I guess, two other points in terms of thinking through preparedness. So how do we think about what are those cross-cutting, broader evidence gaps within government that we know are likely to come up, and sort of start thinking around the evidence base there. So we've recently worked on, these are a few of past topics, extreme heat, drought, adaptive purchasing behavior, but we've also worked recently on evacuation. For example, what is the social science evidence base around, for example, evacuation in the UK in an emergency. And we're currently looking at specifically the social vulnerabilities. So how do we think about different types of crisis, and the groups and communities that are particularly vulnerable in those different contexts. We have as part of this work, we've set up a cross-government steering group. So this is led at the level of chief scientific advisor. So we rotate the chair per year. So we've had Jennifer Rubin, who is the chief scientific advisor for the Home Office, Sarah Sharples, who took over last year in DFT, and currently Paul Taylor, who is the chief scientific advisor in policing, and also all three of them are chief social and behavioral scientists by background. So they provide that sort of leadership and strategic vision. And then we also have a working group that brings together, again, practitioners across government who are working on social and behavioral science in emergencies across different policy areas. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about routes for engagement with government, and then I'll hand over to Kitty. Next slide, please. So I've mentioned sort of policy fellowships as one of the opportunities, but there's also there's a number of different areas where researchers and deep experts can work with policymakers to feed in their area of expertise. Kitty's going to speak in more depth about the areas of research interest and how to better understand the sort of different mechanisms that are set up to better understand how that works. But then there's also all sorts of other opportunities. I mean, calls for evidence, public consultations, scientific advisory committees. So most departments will have an independent group of deep experts working in that field to help advise ministers and policy teams. So that usually they're all sort of structured slightly differently, but it's post recruitment for those roles usually come up every few years, so usually about 3 years or so. So worth checking to see the department where your area falls, to see where that recruitment is and how to be engaged. Other opportunities are the science and engineering fast stream and the GSE profession more generally. Internships, so Go Science has both year-long internships for, again, scientists from all different backgrounds, so both STEM but also social science, and then UKRI fellowships, which are for UKRI funded PhD students and who can come then for 3 months to be embedded within Go Science and work with on a specific policy area. And last to mention, STEM Futures partnerships, which is again focused on STEM, but if you're a social and behavioral scientist working on an area where there's a clear on a sort of STEM area, but from a social science perspective, that's another great opportunity. And we currently have Professor Sarah Hartley, who is an expert in engineering biology from a social science background, embedded into our team through STEM Future. So worth looking into that if that's your an area where you've worked in. Next slide, please. So this is, again, sort of some of the points that I've just mentioned in the last slide. I think I can probably now hand over to Kitty. Next slide.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, on to the next slide. Yeah, massive thank you, Carrie. And yeah, now over to me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the missions. So when the government came in last year, the new government, they came in as a broadly a mission-led government, and missions differ from normal targets in a couple of ways. So missions deal with a really long-term and complex and sort of broadly societal issue. And the five key missions that the government came in with were to fix the NHS, to increase growth and productivity, to improve the safety of our streets, to get closer to reaching our net zero targets, and to increase opportunities for the population. And so those are kind of big set objectives, and they deal with really kind of large issues. But what you might notice is that the mission sets out what the government wants to achieve as an end result, rather than the specific means to do so. So where a government might normally set out something like the spending targets or specific policy angles or stakeholders they want to include in achieving their goals, they actually focus more broadly on the outcome. And theoretically, this should allow for a bit more innovation in addressing those targets and a more flexible approach to that mission. And social and behavioural sciences fit in so well here because they operate so successfully where there is that flexibility and where there is that joining of lots of different disciplines and lots of different approaches together. It brings the kind of human element to these really big questions. And as the missions are really long-standing issues, the solutions aren't immediately apparent. So there's a real scope for collaboration and development of ideas across time, which is just a perfect opportunity for behavioural and social science research input. And I hope that as I've sort of mentioned the missions, you start to think about, they're really important as independent problems and as independent things to address, but actually they're really interconnected. So for example, achieving sustained growth and creating really good jobs for people in the population across the country, which would be relevant to the growth mission and the productivity mission, is really critical to providing legitimate long-term opportunities and alternatives to crime, which would therefore make our streets safer, which feeds into our Safer Streets mission. So the missions, although they're kind of these pillars on their own, they really interconnect in a really sort of meaningful way. And I think academia and the way that research can be applied, particularly behavioural and social science research, can be applied to so many different areas. This issue of interconnectivity, I think, is a really perfect opportunity for behavioural and social science. And the benefit of the missions is that you have an idea of what the government departments are going to be prioritising, what they're going to be thinking about, but how would you know what a specific department was interested in, what questions they want answered? And that is where the areas of research interest come in. Many of you might already know what an ARI is, an area of research interest, but I'm going to go through and I'm going to give you some examples and hopefully inspire you to have a look at the ARIs yourself. So ARIs are a way for government organisations to indicate that they're really interested in hearing research evidence or insights related to a specific question. And they can be super wide-ranging. They can cover anything from kind of social policy to national security. And by identifying ARIs, the civil service is essentially ensuring that they are finding the research and identifying research efforts that are targeted at the evidence that they most need to inform their policy decisions and improve the government's performance in various areas. There was some evidence that suggested that more than 60% of the ARIs related to social science issues. So there really is a good opportunity here for behavioural and social scientists to engage with the government and get really involved. And as you'll see on the slide, there's a sort of website URL, ari.org.uk. So this is a central repository that I think originally started as a bit of a sort of data gathering attempt, but now departments do update it themselves. And it's a really great place to start to find groups or people or teams who might be interested in your work. and they might have asked questions that are related to your work, but maybe come at it from a different angle, but at least you've identified a group of people who might be interested in what you do. Not all government departments update their ARIs onto this repository. Some have a slightly different way of doing ARIs, but it's a really great resource and a brilliant starting point. So I'm going to talk you through the website a little bit. So when you go onto that website, ari.org.uk, this is the top toolbar that you see. There's a search bar there where you can type in keywords, or you could just view all the ARIs, which I think would potentially be a little bit overwhelming. There are many. And what I did was I went in and I put in some keywords, and I've pasted some sort of top hits onto the slide so you can see the sorts of things that you might find on the ARI website. So I searched for behaviour, and I found this absolutely brilliant question from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, MHCLG, from 2025. How does susceptibility to mis and disinformation and its impact, if any, on voting behaviour vary by age? What impact could extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds have on this? So this is a really topical question. We're thinking about voting behaviour, lowering the age of voting, but also this really broad-reaching issue of mis and disinformation comes in here. And this is just a really interesting angle on those two issues. So people who are working on voting behaviour might be interested in contacting this team, but also people working on mis and dis might also be interested in contacting this team. And the see details button that's kind of in that light greeny colour, if you clicked that, it would take you through to another page where normally you would get a lot more information, and you'd also get a link to how to communicate with the team. So that might be an email, for example, so you could get directly in touch with them. I searched for AI, obviously that's a huge priority for so many of us. And again, MHCLG coming through here with some recent questions. I suspect they may have just very recently updated their ARIs. So these are also kind of hot off the press questions. Excuse me. So the first question, what are the best ways in which the use of AI could speed up the planning system, reduce costs for local government, and improve delivery of public services? So a great question about streamlining, which is a huge kind of hope for us all that AI can provide streamlining for these services and for the way that we deliver things that, you know, are quite burdensome. So a really great question there. And the second one is about examples of AI tools being used effectively for data gathering from local authorities, creating a less burdensome approach to gathering data, analysis or reporting. I think this really kind of probably appeals to a lot of the academics in the room who are really interested in using AI to streamline their data gathering processes. And again, here you might not have information particularly on local authorities, but you might know something more broadly about how AI can be used to streamline that data gathering process, and even to do analysis and to report your data. So someone working on something tangential to this might still be really of interest to that team. And finally, I searched for climate, which is, you know, a huge issue, and it's also one of the missions. So what are the downstream impacts of climate change on criminality and policing's operating model? That's from UK Policing. And here you can see that really key interconnectivity that I mentioned before, the impact of climate change, net zero, on our Safer Streets mission. How do these two things interconnect with each other? And the second example is just as good in terms of interconnectivity. So what's the effect of the transition to net zero on productivity and growth? I mean, it couldn't be any clearer. So yeah, here are some really good examples of ARIs that the government is really interested in, that they want to hear evidence on. This is them kind of calling out for evidence on these questions, and also a really great illustration of how the missions and these key areas of interest across the government as a whole interconnect with each other. So I wanted to talk, before we close, a little bit about the role that I'm in, which is a really interesting and quite unusual role funded by the ESRC as part of their National Capability in Behavioural Research investment, which led to the funding of Behavioural Research UK. So I'm a senior policy fellow. I was funded I'm funded for 3 years, which is, you know, a pretty long stint in academia. That's a good contract length. But what's really interesting about this role in terms of the length of contract is that I'm based at UCL in Behavioural Research UK, but for the entirety of my 3 years, I'm seconded at least half time to the Government Office for Science. So that is an exceptionally long secondment. Most secondments don't last more than a year. So I'm 10 months in, and it's been a real eye-opener into how the government works and how academia works with the government. And really, that was the whole purpose of this role. The role was funded specifically to bridge the gap between academia and the government over time. So to really develop those relationships. And one of the key aims of this role is to connect up academia and policymakers. They operate in these two very separate silos, and quite often they want to connect, but they don't necessarily know how to. It's a question I get asked all the time. How do I find the right person? So a role like mine is really in position to connect up people who are wanting to make connections and work together. Sometimes they do work together, but they don't work together at the opportune moments. So there might be a moment where policymakers are really crying out for some scientific advice on a specific topic, but they just don't have the connections at that moment in time. So not only am I there to connect people up, but to try and capitalise on those opportune moments when they arise. Even when they do connect, quite often academics and policymakers struggle to communicate with each other. They write and they work and they communicate in very different ways quite often, and sometimes struggle to see things from the other's perspective. So it's helpful to have a role like mine, bridging that gap between those two spaces, translating those messages and those needs across the two spaces. And finally, I'm here really to identify opportunities. There's so much work going on in both spaces, in the social and behavioural sciences space, in this case, Behavioural Research UK, but also much more broadly, that shares tons of goals and interests with what's going on in government. But both sides don't know what the other is doing. So that can result in sometimes duplication of work, but it definitely results in missed opportunities for collaboration, and it lowers the possibility of really high impact. And ultimately, it leads to kind of less or weaker evidence being used in policymaking, which is not what we want. We want there to be high quality evidence going into evidence-based policies. So my role, therefore, is to really pay attention to the needs of both of the spaces, to find the overlap and the areas where experts on both sides have a shared goal, have a shared interest and come together, but also to identify gaps and strengthen the responses to those gaps. So the two ultimate aims are to improve the scientific evidence base used in policymaking, and policymaking and the evidence that's used in it significantly benefits from the breadth and the colour that social and behavioural sciences bring beyond kind of STEM and that kind of traditional science evidence. And secondly, to really increase the impact of behavioural research in government, to find those opportunities, not only to identify them on their own, but to identify when we can collaborate earlier in the policy-making process. So often social and behavioural sciences is brought in right at the end, and we really want to ensure that social and behavioural sciences are embedded throughout that entire process. Also want to up the profile of behavioural research across government and the opportunities that it brings in policy, and communicate those policy priorities back to researchers so that the researchers can conduct work that is much more likely to be relevant and to be impactful. And just briefly, just two really key reflections that I have since starting 10 months ago in this role that's seconded to Go Science, on how social and behavioural science operates in government. The first is the importance of having key champions for social and behavioural sciences in a world that doesn't necessarily automatically prioritise that discipline. So in Go Science, we have Carrie, who has just really trailblazed and led the social and behavioural sciences in Go Science, conducted some brilliant pieces of work that then others in the department see happening and think, oh, that worked really, really well. I think we could maybe use something like that here. And I think having that kind of emergency angle on things, people really see and appreciate the benefit that social and behavioural sciences brings, and then they want to include it into non-emergency scenarios and non-emergency pieces of work too. So I just think having people who champion social and behavioural sciences and really can show the benefit and the impact is so valuable in a place like Go Science. But equally, we also, as Carrie said, we have Angela, who is not a social scientist by background. She's our government chief scientific advisor, but she has been brilliant at taking on that social behavioural science mantle into rooms where there are really senior decision makers and really pushing for the inclusion of social and behavioural sciences in much broader projects, but also saying, you have this question, why don't we think about using social and behavioural sciences to address it? And so having people championing social behavioural sciences, but also having leadership that takes the discipline into those really key spaces is so valuable. And the second thing I wanted to reflect upon was the issue of trust. This came up in a submitted question ahead of the webinar. How do we build trust? How do policymakers who are potentially a little bit wary of expertise, how do they build trust in us? And really my answer here, and this is something that feeds into my reflections and my observations, is that impact in policy is so much about relationships. Policymakers and academics need to work together in a consistent and reciprocal way to make sure that both sides are getting what they need from that relationship. It's not helpful for policymakers to tell academics what to do, nor is it helpful for academics to demand that policymakers use their work right at the end of a project that then isn't really tailored for policy at all. Instead, the best impact comes when there's a relationship that has developed over time, where there's been give and take, where there's been sharing of priorities and sharing of resources, and sharing of credit as well. I think that's a really valuable way of moving forward. And as those relationships develop over time, that trust also develops as well. And I think the scientific community, trust is a really important aspect for us. We have a really kind of checkered history around practices and ethics and how things are used and interpreted. And it's really important for us to consider how trust is engendered. And I think considering how we use these relationships and benefit these relationships and really nurture those relationships is the best way to build trust. This is a slide from BRUK as an acknowledgement of all of their collaborators and to acknowledge ESRC's funding as well. And just to say a huge thank you to everybody for listening. Carrie and my emails are both on the screen here if you would like to note them down. They're very straightforward. And we're now going to move to a Q&A. So huge thank you for listening and over to the Q&A. Okay, let me go to the Q&A box. We have maybe quite a procedural question for you, Carrie, on can a final year PhD student outside of the UK apply for any of the internships or postdoc fellowships?
So I think on the whole, the roles within government are restricted to UK citizens as well as people with the right to work in the UK. I think potentially one exception are the UKRI funded internships. So that is, although don't quote me on this, but I would think that if you are doing a PhD in the UK and you are funded by UKRI, you are therefore eligible to also do an internship. And I mean, worth saying as well that UKRI internships there are a number of spots within Go Science, but there are also opportunities within other organizations who are working with it, either within, for example, the Foreign Office, FCDO, the Parliamentary Office for Science and Technology, which is sits within Parliament, also hosts UKRI internships. So worth thinking broadly, I think, about where those opportunities are. If you do not have the right to work in the UK, I think another potential route, if if this is an area that you're interested, is through consultancies. So quite a lot of research within government is commissioned to external research consultancies. And that's another good way so if you work for these consultancies, you can then get that experience as well around working for government, UK government commissioned work. And I think that that's an opportunity where you don't necessarily, there's sort of broader criteria for employment.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, that's all really helpful information. There's been a couple of questions in the chat about working, being from abroad, and whether these opportunities are UK based. That's really helpful information for all of those participants. Let me just refresh. So Florence asked, what's the best way to find relevant opportunities within Go Science and other similar departments? What do you think, Carrie?
So civil service jobs is a good place to start. Our 1 year Go Science internships are always advertised there, and I think actually, and I should probably know this, but the Go Science gov.uk site should also have list opportunities there as well.
Thanks, Carrie. And also, I mean, my contribution to this is that I think the best way is to always just have conversations with as many people as you can, really branch out your networks. A lot of the sort of opportunities, they can come through formal funding mechanisms, but they can also come through informal processes as well. So, you know, making sure that you're making the most of the conferences that you go to, the seminars that you go to, chatting to the people that you're hearing speak and you're meeting and you're finding interesting, I think is a really important way of finding not only an opportunity, but the right opportunity for you. So thank you, Florence, for that question.
I was going to add to that as well. I mentioned UPenn earlier, so that's the Universities Policy Exchange Network, and that they have that is, I mean, it's quite a good resource for a number of different things, including opportunities. So that's not specific to behavioral research, that's broader to sort of researchers more generally. But I'll put the link to that in the chat to look at. And then I would also suggest as well engagement officers and knowledge exchange university sort of offices within your respective university. Often they will have those relationships and sort of understanding of opportunities with government and policy, and might be worthwhile speaking to.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, that's a great answer. So we have, remember everybody to upvote the questions that you want to see answered most, otherwise it's chair's privilege to pick them. So this one from Stephen, if we have research that we think can contribute to an ARI, what's the best way to share? That's a good question. So on the ARI website, when you find a question that you have research that you want to contribute, if you click the kind of see details button that was sort of in green at the bottom of those questions, that will take you through to kind of the question page. Not always, but normally there will be a bit of background information there. There will be sort of a little bit more about the team, maybe about the broader aim, because the questions normally will be feeding into a larger piece of work, so they might provide some more information about that. But also there will be information about the team itself, so the team who have put the question on the ARI website, there will be an email for them, there will be some way to contact them included on that page. So make use of that. That's why it's such a great resource, because it's not just the question that's being asked, but it's actually, we want you to contact us, here is how you should do it. I suppose one thing I would say is, civil servants are very, very busy. If you reply or you send in information in response to an ARI and you don't get a response, send a follow-up. Just make sure that you're making yourself known, because they did ask for that information and it's important that they see it. So that's another one. Let me refresh. Are there any opportunities for more senior roles? If one has, say, 15 years of post-PhD experience in academia, can one enter higher up? Carrie?
Yes, absolutely. So it depends in what capacity. There are obviously, there will be jobs, sort of research jobs, government social research, or in some of the other professions, where there is sort of an interest in having candidates with deep expertise in that area, and those will be advertised in civil service jobs. I mentioned earlier the Science Advisory Committee. So if you're interested, if you're an academic or a research expert with a sort of full-time job, but want to play a role in advising government, then applying for a science advisory committee role is probably appropriate. And then also worth mentioning that policy fellowships, there are opportunities across different sort of career stages. So I think many of the policy fellowships are at sort of early mid-career, but there are also opportunities. I mean, I know, for example, within DSIT, so this is the Department for Science, Innovation, and Technology. There is an expert exchange scheme, which is at different and including at senior levels. FCVO, the Foreign Office, also has opportunities for senior research fellows. And then again, I mentioned STEM Futures, which is primarily directed at STEM experts. But if you have expertise from a sort of social science perspective on science and technology issues, then that's another route for academics or researchers at a more advanced stage in their career. I mean, also just to mention, Angela McLean, the Chief Scientific Advisor, is incredibly keen on bringing in more deep expertise, not just at junior level, but at senior level as well into government, and feels quite strongly about that being really important to sort of good government and good policy making. So I think, just having worked in government now for about 9 years, it feels to me like it's an area that just continues to grow, and there's sort of expanding interest in terms of strengthening those links and thinking about other different models for bringing those two communities together.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, I really hope that we're reflecting that there are those kind of early stage career opportunities, but really there's so much desire and demand for expertise, real deep developed expertise in topic areas. So please don't feel disheartened if you're much further through your career. That there definitely is demand for you and your skills in lots of different avenues of access to the civil service. So yeah, I hope we're reflecting that. There's a question in the chat which hasn't had as many upvotes, but it's a great question. So I'm just going to answer it because I think it's really important in terms of this question of impact. Is it possible, appropriate to cite the ARIs as part of proposals and rationales for research projects? Yes, do that. That is a really, really solid grounding for describing and justifying how your project is relevant to policy, and that is becoming more and more important. Thinking about that academic side of my role and all the priorities and the pressures on that side, proving, justifying that your work is going to be relevant for policy is going to become, it probably already is, but if it's not, it's going to become an absolutely crucial point of judging your applications and your proposals. And it's a brilliant way of explaining that actually what you're doing is directly relevant to policy because they are asking for it. So yeah, please do that. That's a brilliant question. What else do we have? We've got more questions about opportunities, internships. Again, make sure you are looking at UPenn's website, make sure that you are looking at civil service jobs, finding those opportunities. What else do we have? Anastasia has asked, maybe Carrie, you could just expand a little on what you've already said. Could you please send the details about the opportunities for senior roles, brackets consulting, that you've just mentioned? So how do those kind of consultation type roles work for those more senior academics?
So I'm also going to just put the link to, oh gosh, I will. I'll put the link to the Go Science opportunities in the chat in just a second. And give me just 1 second to do that. So this will have opportunity, some more information specifically around jobs, internships, and also the civil service fast stream, which I didn't mention, and actually is one worth considering as well, insofar as both the civil service fast stream has a policy profession, but it also has strands for social research, for social researchers, for example, as well as the science and engineering profession. And there we go. So I put that there. So in terms of consultancies, to be honest, that's I'm much more familiar with the government side, but I'm also aware that there are, so many different consultancies that advertise for sort of short-term projects. I mean, frontier economics. I mean, then there's sort of more obvious ones for behavioral insights team and Nesta. So it might be worth just having a sort of chat with some of those. In terms of how it works within government, there are particular frameworks for procurement, so that when a policy team or a sort of social research team has a business case for a particular project or area of interest, they then use those frameworks to sort of commission externally. But if that's something that is of interest, I can try and do a little bit of digging to see if there's any sort of starter for tens on how that works.
Thanks, Carrie. Yeah, hopefully we can share some links after the session. I hope that some of those resources will be helpful. There's a question that was submitted ahead of time for this session that I think is quite an interesting one to reflect on. And I don't know that there is a kind of a right answer, but it's more, I suppose, more of an exploratory one for Carrie and I to think about. But how can the lessons, I suppose, the social and behavioural sciences related lessons learnt in the UK apply to low and middle income countries? I think that's a great question, because I think it's something that we need to be considering. I think in the government particularly, because we have such a UK focus, at times an England focus in Whitehall, that it can be really easy to sort of become quite blinkered and just think about it in our own context, because that's the immediate context that we're surrounded by, which makes a lot of sense. But I think that academia is so good at thinking about how things generalize and how things can be applied to different spaces. And I will pass over to Carrie to talk about this, but I think just something that I've observed that I wasn't necessarily involved in, but thinking about emergencies and what can we learn from emergency situations in other countries when they happen, what can we then translate back over to the UK context, is such an interesting question, and vice versa. What is it that we learn from a social and behavioural science perspective in the UK when we have, for example, we had the riots in England and Northern Ireland in 2024. Are there going to be lessons that we can learn from that, from a social behavioural sciences perspective, that we can then apply to other contexts, whether they be low middle income or just kind of very different to the UK? I think they are really important questions. Carrie, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I mean, great question. And I mean, in terms of my own sort of career journey, I started out as my academic background is as a social anthropologist, and I worked, all of my research was in India. So that was sort of my foundation in terms of before coming into government, and then I once I started in government, shifted to working almost exclusively in the UK. So I worked on decarbonization, sort of energy decarbonization, reproductive and maternal health in the UK, and now on emergencies, and how do we sort of draw from the social and behavioral science evidence base to inform emergency crisis response and emergency preparedness. So yeah, I mean it's I mean worth saying that whilst the work that we do is primarily based on the UK context, there's obviously sort of Foreign Office and areas that are more interested or sort of focus more on the sort of international context, which will draw more from the um, sort of a broader evidence base and context from lower middle income countries. Um, I mean, I've found as well, I think uh, I mean, Kitty mentioned the work that she's been contributing to and leading on the Southport riots, and certainly there, I think there's both work. I mean, I think there's really interesting evidence from that project, which I think is part of that broader evidence base on how we understand collective violence and violence in different contexts, that we can not necessarily, maybe not apply to different contexts, but certainly learn from in terms of the impact of different contexts on how riots and violence and mis and disinformation function. So I'm not sure I answered it, but I think there's loads of this. It's a really interesting question, and I think one that we can sort of worth thinking about more generally as well in terms of the work that we do.
Yeah, and I think just hearing you speak, Carrie, it's making me remember how well placed social and behavioural sciences are to think about how knowledge and evidence does or does not translate to another context. We have that perspective that other disciplines just don't incorporate, thinking about, social expectations, cultural norms, societal expectations, all of those things that are so important to think about when considering generalization. We're really well placed to be able to consider that question in its entirety. So I think one final question. There's lots in the chat about is there an opportunity for this or for me? And I think I would just point you towards the resources that we've mentioned. I'm hoping that we can share the slides around as well as those links afterwards so you can really dig in yourself to find the right opportunity for you, because we're not going to know what the right opportunity for you is. So we can't really advise you on that, but we'll provide you with as much information as we can. One final question about evaluation, Carrie. How is behavioural research kind of evaluated in government? What are your thoughts on that in a nutshell?
Another really great question. Again, I can't speak for government as a whole, and I'm sure there will be thinking and work done in this space that I'm not aware of. Certainly, in terms of the work that we do in the sort of emergencies context, we are sort of constantly thinking about not just producing particular evidence reviews or sort of outputs, but also how do we know that this evidence is being used in the way that it's intended, that it's being useful to the people and the teams that it is directed at. And I think one of the complications is obviously there are a number of different teams at different levels and different places within government who we're sort of directing the work at, and will have different needs. So just for example, thinking in terms of some of the pieces we've done on evacuation, the social behavioral science evidence base for evacuation, we have worked with policy teams in Cabinet Office to feed this into guidance that they're developing on I think it's mass evacuation, but also thinking about local resilience forums. So teams working very much at that local context and sort of first responder context to sort of well, A, make the evidence available to them, but B, understand, how is this useful? Is it useful? If it's not useful, then how can we change it to make it more useful? So it's very much a sort of ongoing project, but one that we're really interested in, and I think speaks to a sort of a larger theme in terms of there's a growing body of work now around what we know about how evidence and research is actually used in practice in government. So whilst we know that just making the evidence available on a website or even in a paper and sending it over, that may be a first step, but that is the first of many steps, and oftentimes it's quite a complex process. So again, a really important question and an issue to be thinking about, and very much interested in if there's particular ideas or sort of research that's been done specifically around behavior research that you can share with us as well.
Thanks, Carrie. I'm going to end the session there. We're at time. And just to reiterate, huge thanks for coming. And if you have any questions or any feedback or any reflections or any work that you want to share with us, please do contact either Carrie or I by email. But otherwise, just to say a huge thank you for coming, and thank you to BR UK for hosting this webinar. So take care, everybody.